Welcome to Overkill Reviews. I'm Sam Dunn, and I'm very proud to be doing my first review straight from the Banger Hangar. Or is it Banger Hangar? I'm not quite sure. Let us know. But it's great to be here, and basically what you see behind me is the collection of roughly 15 years of metal filmmaking at Banger, as well as a few personal treasures. What do we have? We've got my first Slayer Rain and Blood poster with my Dayglow abortion stickered plastered to it, as I did as a teenager. What else do we have? We also have Pestilence Consuming Impulse on cassette, of course, and to play that cassette, I've got my cassette deck from that time. But my all-time favorite piece is my son Rory's rendition of Iron Maiden's Book of Souls cover. Check it out. He's 5. I'm a proud papa. Before I get into this week's review, a couple of housekeeping items. One, you can now give your own skull rating on the records we review here on Overkill Reviews if you go to BangerTV.com. And also, please remember to subscribe to help us continue to build the empire that is Banger TV. Well, enough about that. This week, I'm reviewing this record. This week I'm going to be digging into what is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating and ever-evolving bands in the metal underground, and also, I think, one of the best extreme metal bands ever to come out of Norway, which of course has produced its fair share of metal bands. That band, of course, is Enslaved, and their new album, simply titled E, is out today worldwide on Nuclear Blast Records. The story of Enslaved goes back to 1991, when founding members Ivar Bjornsson and Grutle Kjeldsen formed the band. And at the outset, Enslaved was arguably a fairly traditional black metal band over the course of its first few records. But then the band started to experiment and shift their sound and start to play with much more progressive elements. And since the addition of a full-time keyboardist around the early 2000s, the band really has been on a balls-out course to broaden the sound to including many more prog elements and really drifting away from that traditional extreme black metal sound. It's worth noting also that I reviewed Enslaved's last album called In Times in 2015. And at that time, we were doing the simple 2 skull rating, and I gave it 2 out of 2 skulls. So, let's see. Does E stack up? Let's get into it. Now, before I get into the music on this record, it's worth spending a little time talking about the concept behind it. Enslaved fans will know that this is a band that reaches for some pretty deep philosophical and mythological content on their records when it comes to imagery and lyrics, and E is no exception. Of course, E being the first letter of Enslaved, that makes perfect sense, but according to the band, it has a much deeper meaning. The letter E has a runic connection in Norse mythology, which stands for Avas, which apparently is Odin's horse. Why a horse? Well, the band on this record is guided by the concept of duality, of man and nature, man's inner conscience and the outer conscience, rather than focusing on subjects of individuality and the individual standing up against larger forces, which has pretty much dominated the lyrical matter of their earlier records. Whew. Enough concept. Let's get to the music. Over the course of the last few records, Enslaved has been moving in a much more progressive direction, especially in the vocal department. Former keyboardist Herbrand Larsen really brought a lot of clean, melodic vocal stylings to the band's sound. And what's clear from the outset of E is that this album is no exception. The only difference being is it's now a group effort. New keyboardist Hakan Vinya is contributing vocally, as well as main man Grutla, as well as the producer of the record, giving the band that even deeper choral sound than in the past. But never fear, fans of that more guttural style of Enslaved, Grutla still knows how to growl with the best of them. This opening track, Storm Sun, really bears a lot of the hallmarks of Enslaved sound that we've seen develop over the past few records. Really expansive arrangements and even more expansive production. And what's clear also, though, is that they're giving some pretty subtle nods to some old school black metal bands, particularly Bathory. From the horse whinny at the top of the track to these cannon explosions ever so nicely nestled in behind this ripper. This really is classic modern Enslaved at work here. During the course of that section of Storm Sun, we move from that extreme metal pounder into a much more melancholic, floating section. And clocking in at over 10 minutes, Storm Sun is a really ambitious start to E. So let's see what the rest of the record has to offer. Track 3 on E is called Sacred Horse and is probably, as you guessed by the title, the most literal treatment of the concept behind this record. And this song really gets going at the point where they hit one of those typically Enslaved, jagged, angular riffs. What this clip got me thinking about is, after a band has been making records for 25 years, we begin to lose sight, I think, of the things that they actually created themselves. And that section in this song of Sacred Horse could have appeared on a record 5 years ago with Enslaved, but really it made me realize that this is a specific riffing style, a specific combination of instruments and sounds that Enslaved has created and now perfected. Speaking of perfection, I think this might be my favorite part of the record. Really love this section that closes out Sacred Horse, and it reminded me that these big, epic Viking chanting parts go all the way back to Havenless, which of course we used in Metal: A Headbanger's Journey, and again is a sound that I think Enslaved really created and continues to perfect to this day. Anyway, Sacred Horse is the third song of only 6 on E, so we're halfway through. Let's see what the back half has to offer. The The last song on E is called Hindsight, and if there's one song that captures the duality behind this record in a musical sense, I think it's this song. It opens with what is a really kind of gentle, drifting, high guitar part, and then Thor's hammer comes crashing down. This really is a phenomenally heavy part in Hindsight. I think the boys showing some autopsy influences on their sleeve when Doom was Doom before Doom. Anyway, it really feels like Grutle there is belching from a cave in the southern coast of Norway. But I think what's most important is, like bands like, say, Opeth or Mastodon that have also been around for 15, 20, 25 years, when these mature bands really launch into those heavy parts, they make a huge impact. And speaking of influences, the album closes out with an undoubted nod to the Masters' Pink Floyd. So the band wraps out E on the song Hindsight much like it began, with a group melodic vocal effort. And really that's one of the standouts on this record compared to earlier Enslaved albums, that the vocal melodies are getting deeper and richer. Now, did you hear the sax? I heard the sax. Got nothing wrong with a little Coltrane or Wayne Shorter here and there, but not sure it works here. Something about reeds against metallic guitars don't really work for me, but that's beside the point. Let's get to the verdict. Enslaved is a band I've been following for a long time and been a fan of really since their albums Marjoram and Monumention from the early 2000s. I'm also one of those fans that has embraced their more progressive direction. I'm not a purist that wants another Frost or Eld. And really E does continue in that progressive direction, and I think largely succeeds. This is great songwriting, this is great instrumentation, and there's some really strong concepts behind this album. My only criticism would be is it's 6 songs, and I really felt that the 3 I didn't talk about today don't quite stack up to the 3 that I did. When I weigh it against earlier Enslaved records, I get much more picky. I start to micro-analyze this song against that song, etc., etc., etc. But when put against the larger metal, rock, and even music landscape, I think Enslaved is one of the best bands out there. And for that reason, I give E 4 out of 5 skulls. And don't forget to weigh in yourselves. Go to BangerTV.com and tell me your skull rating. We'll see you next time.